Welcome back to the University of Idaho, University of Wyoming, and Utah State University collaborative sheep and goat webinar series that we do on a monthly basis. You know me, Melinda Ellison, University of Idaho, Extension Sheep Specialist. Whit Stewart is also one of our collaborators, the University of Wyoming Extension Sheep Specialist. We have Chad Page, who is the Utah State Small Ruminant Specialist, and Carmen Wilmore, who's also University of Idaho, out of Lincoln County, who serves as our goat specialist in Idaho. And so the four of us bring a monthly webinar to you. And this webinar today will be talking about reproductive strategies. So hopefully you guys can gain some insight as you go into your breeding season. And today, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Lisa Serber, who's out of South Dakota. And she is the owner and operator of LM Livestock Services, as well as the executive secretary of the South Dakota Sheep Growers Association. And today she's joining us to talk about making selection decisions in wool sheep. So we appreciate you joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
You bet. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys today. I don't know what it's like in everybody else's neck of the woods, but here in the western side of South Dakota, it's downright nasty. We're getting sideways snow and 35-mile-an-hour winds, and down towards the Black Hills, there's about a foot of snow in the Black Hills and in the southeast corner of Montana and the northeast corner of Wyoming. So it's pretty western over here. So hopefully you're enjoying some nicer weather than I am. So when I got invited to do this presentation, we kind of played around with topic ideas, and I thought it might be interesting for the viewership here that we talk a little bit about making some selections, particularly on the ewe side of things in wool sheep. And so that's where I'm going to spend the majority of my time today. I'm also going to, as we get to the end of my presentation, I am going to talk a little bit about ultrasounding, and particularly on the seed stock side of things, and talk just briefly about that. This summer, I was out in Idaho and worked with a group out there doing some certification process for learning how to scan. And so I think that's where the idea of me talking about this kind of evolved. So hopefully I can get through this without any technical difficulties. The power has been going off and on all morning, so if I lose you somehow, I'll try and get back on as quick as I can. This is just kind of a rundown of some of the things that I do for my business, and I'll talk a little bit about it at the end, but I'm kind of a jack of all trades. Those of you that know me know that I do a lot of different things in the industry besides being the executive secretary for the sheep growers. So invite you to visit some of my social media, particularly my business page. I do quite a bit of sheep marketing and educational type content, so you might enjoy that. I'm going to talk first a little bit about what, kind of the idea is about picking our replacement wool sheep, and why it might be challenging for some people, particularly if you don't have much experience either classing or grading wool. Looking at fleeces on a sheep might be a bit of a challenge for you. And quite frankly, most of us who are involved in wool processing or shearing, or basically the day-to-day work with your sheep, you might be more used to looking at shorn fleeces, which on a skirting table would be flesh side out, compared to the opposite when you're looking at a fleece on a live animal. And so again, I think it's a challenge for people who haven't done it before, but you can easily get more adapted to doing it. Quite frankly, in most of our region, if you're raising wool sheep, you should make this a part of your selection process, and it will directly impact your flocks or your sheep enterprise profitability, because you're trying to select a more uniform sheep. So ultimately your wool clip is more uniform. So being able to do it in a quick, efficient, and cost-effective manner, looking at a large number of traits is ultimately your goal. Most of the time we're doing this sometime either in the summer or fall, when you're picking your final, basically your final cut of replacement ewes. And the objective of this process is to identify and retain those sheep in your flock that will ultimately improve your flock returns both now, and hopefully that sheep stays in your flock for a period of time, and you're going to produce more productive progeny from that sheep as well. So having clear, well-defined objectives for what you're looking for is obviously the place to start. Having a balance of traits rather than, I think I went, let's see if I can back up a little bit. There we go. All right, sorry about that. I hit a button. I was going to try and move my little window around so I could see my screen better. My apologies. So you're not trying to single trait select for any one particular trait, rather than you're trying to have a balance of many traits to consider. And the idea of doing this is you want to be able to look at that sheep when it's best reflecting those traits, meaning that you've got the most wool to look at. And sometimes that's not always possible, but you want to try and do it at least at the best time that you possibly can, given your management system. So if you're picking replacement ewes, particularly, wool sheep, you're trying to do this when ewes are as old as possible, meaning if they're young sheep, you want to pick them as far into that cycle as possible, meaning that you get rid of some of the confounding effects of birth type, date of birth, dam type, rearing type. Those things can all influence the size or the length of the wool, those type of things. We want to try and exclude those traits as much as possible. You want to do it obviously before breeding, and you make those breeding decisions on mating, and you want that sheep to be in as much wool as possible. The longer the wool, the greater the variation in the fleece weight that it is expressed, and easier to see differences. For instance, staple length. That's a big one that we would be concerned with, and that age can have a tremendous amount of effect on that. Just as a reminder, fleece traits are highly repeatable, and therefore selections made at 16 months of age can be a good indicator of that animal's future wool production. You could also evaluate a lot of other traits of that animal. For instance, conformation, things that we typically kind of just do second nature, like jaw traits, feet and legs, and teats. These are all very important characteristics for a breeding female, and so we want to pay attention to them. And I am going to touch briefly on some of these. So when we're looking at a sheep, kind of where do we start? And I think this illustration does a pretty good job of telling you where you should be looking across the sheep and drawing a line across it. And the 1, 2, and 3 essentially represents shoulder, side, and bridge. And you're trying to make sure that number one, that sheep is uniform across those areas. And some of our undesirable traits don't exceed going up above that line. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those. So you want to take your hands, and I wish I had a video of this, but might be something for the future. Take both your hands and make a wide split in the wool to look at the fleece, and going across from front to back. And you're looking at the uniformity of that fleece. And that's a really, really good place to start. If you're going to compare an animal that you're evaluating with the grade of wool that animal is bred to produce, I think that's really important to do. We have breed standards for some of our major breeds. Although I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, some breeds don't pay attention to those as much as we'd like them to. but it is a really important, to follow your breed standard. And in the Rambouillets, their breed standard is supposed to be 60s to 70s. Now I am talking about spinning count. Targees 58s to 64s. Of course, we know Targees can get a lot finer than that, and same with Rambouillets. Columbia, in the blood system, we're talking about half blood to quarter blood, and this is taken straight off of their website with regard to breed standards. So we're trying to, and I only addressed kind of the big three. I know there's many other breeds that are considered wool breeds and that would have standards as well, but these are the ones that I'm referencing today. And if the average of those 3 points, remember the 1, 2, and 3, the shoulder, side, and breech, should correspond to the range of fiber diameter or grades representative of that breed. So we don't want to see that breech on that Targhee get much coarser than what the breed standards are. We want a uniform fleece because that is, very heritable. So uniformity of fiber diameter, both breeds and individuals within a breed will vary in fiber diameter uniformity. I mean, we know that, but we're trying to minimize the amount of variation that we see. And fleeces should be uniform from front to rear. And I've already kind of touched on that. We'll see less variability in some breeds if we're talking about maybe Merino and Rambouillet. With some of our composite breeds, we may see more variability. That doesn't mean that we like it or that we should accept it, but we may see more of it. Animals that vary more than 5 microns from shoulder to breech should not be kept as replacement stock. And you might ask yourself, well, how the heck am I going to know if there's a 5 micron variation? And the answer to that is, we've got superior wool labs in this country and people that do wool testing. And, if you're unsure, send samples away. It's an inexpensive test to get that information. And so please consider doing that. The finest fibers typically we see on the shoulder, and the coarsest fibers obviously are on the back end or the breech of the sheep. I kind of already alluded to this, but certainly fiber diameter selection, there are some breeders across the country that are very, very focused on making sure that their flock or their wool clip meets certain standards. And one of the easiest ways to do that is using the OFTA technology, which some of our wool labs all have access to. Some of them do work in the country and some of them don't. The OFTA stands for Optical Fiber Diameter Analyzer, which is an Australian piece of equipment that we have a number of across the US. It allows us to examine some traits besides just micron. We can look at the variation within that sample. We can look at comfort factor, meaning the percentage of the fibers that are greater than or less than 30 micron. Remember, 30 micron is the point at which a fiber will butt up against your skin and it won't bend, and therefore it'll feel prickly. In addition, we can look at curvature, which is kind of an interesting trait being tracked within NSIP. It essentially looks at the crimp of the sample. We can also look at staple length, something as simple as staple length. And so there are some major wool producing flocks across the country that utilize this technology and have done tremendous changes in their flock over time or over a short period of time in order to meet the needs of what their customer is looking for. So again, this technology is available, and to be able to send samples into a wool lab is certainly ideal. I'm going to talk a little bit about staple length. Okay, I've already touched quite a bit on fiber diameter, and let's kind of focus in on staple length because that is an important trait. Of course, we're always looking for 3-inch wool or 75 millimeters, and granted, this year some of our drought conditions certainly were to a detriment of wool growth and staple length. But this is a trait that we need to pay attention to. Staple length and uniformity of length play a major role in determining the value of wool. And each grade of wool has a minimum length to be classified as what we consider staple. And so this is an important characteristic that we need to track. And this kind of comes out of the handbook, the SID handbook. And basically the longer the wool, the longer the staple needs in order to meet the staple length requirements. And so I know that in some of our terminal breeds or some of our meat breeds, staple length is becoming an issue. And I know that they're certainly not bred for that, but we do still harvest the wool from those breeds. And it seems like those fleeces are becoming less dense and shorter stapled. This photograph is a really old one, but it is a good illustration. These are staples taken from one fleece. And you might think to yourself, oh, on the left side of that, that's just an error in shearing. No, it's actually not. That could be from a particular region of the sheep that just has a little bit shorter staple. And so even in a normal setting, you can have quite a bit of variation across a sheep. But again, we need to continue to focus on staple length, and many breeds do focus on that. And certainly the Rambouillet and the Targhee breed have been tracking staple length within an NSIP and the Merinos and Columbia to some extent as well. I'm going to touch a little bit now, and I know I seem like I'm going fast, but you know, we kind of have a time frame that I need to stick to here, so I'm trying to get through all of this material. So I'm going to talk a little bit about fleece character, and particularly for those of you that are involved in the hand spinning market and selecting sheep that will meet a very specific needs of the fiber industry. Character can be a big deal, and I describe character as the overall appearance of the fleece. It includes things like crimp, color, handle, lock formation, these kind of more difficult characteristics to objectively measure. You have to have some kind of subjective standard is what is acceptable to you. We know crimp is the natural waviness of the wool. Well-crimped wools usually pass a high tensile strength test. They're stronger wools. Wools lacking in crimp have a tendency to break during processing. So crimp is an important characteristic that we look at. Uniformity of that crimp throughout the length of the staple is very desirable. So meaning that the amplitude of that crimp should be uniform from tip to base. Things like environment or feed will have an impact on that, but we want that staple to be fairly uniform. We also want that crimp to be uniform in terms of style from front to back of the sheep. I will talk a little bit about color. Color is very important, particularly if you're dealing with more commercial purposes, that if you have a yellow tendency or a yellow coloring of the wool instead of bright and white, that can impact the end product that can be made from that particular fleece. And so color is very important. And I'm not talking about, I'm talking about color in white sheep. Color is also extremely important in the hand spinning market, and which we can have a whole spectrum of colors. But again, uniformity is typically a very important trait. Bright white wools have more value and take dyes more uniformly than yellow or discolored wools. Talk a little bit about yield, and again, kind of a more difficult trait to track, but it is possible. Yield is the amount of clean wool that's obtained from a grease wool sample, after scouring, and typically is expressed as a percentage. Those of you that have larger clips of wool typically will have your wool core tested and will have a really good idea of yield. It's very difficult for a small producer to kind of get an idea of yield unless you're prepared, at least currently, to send samples overseas to be tested. If all the animals being evaluated in a group of replacements have been run together since their last shearing, you can do a fairly good assessment of the amount of dirt, or the depth of that dirt penetration, and the amount of lanolin, or just basically vegetable matter that has penetrated the fleece. Obviously, that picture on the right is an extremely clean, high yielding example. If that dirt and veg is able to penetrate down into the fleece more, that means that fleece is open. It might not have the density, and we'll talk a little bit about density in just a minute, but in order to shed some of that undesirable impurities in your wool. So density is an important characteristic to track as well. Density refers to the closeness or the compactness of the fibers in the fleece. The more fibers per square inch, the denser that fleece is. And basically, when you're assessing density, or when you're running sheep down a race and you want to assess density, there's kind of two trains of thought, I guess, on being able to check for density on a live animal. You can part the fleece and basically look at the amount of skin that's exposed as an indicator of density, or in other words, the less skin you see, the denser the fleece. That seems kind of intuitive, but also the density can be evaluated by basically taking your hand and grabbing a handful of wool and squeezing it. How much wool do you have in your hand? How dense is that fleece? Again, obviously the more dense that fleece is, the more wool that animal should have. Density, more dense fleece is desirable, less dirt penetration, more pounds of wool. I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe a topic that is not necessarily controversial, but it's an important characteristic that not a lot of people know how to assess, and belly wool can be a big deal. And belly wool is wool that grows on the belly of a sheep. It has some characteristics that's undesirable to be in the majority of your fleece. It's often uneven, it can be tender, it can be shorter, it can vary in terms of grade from the main part of the fleece. And so we don't want that belly wool to creep up the side of the animal and reduce the amount of pounds of wool that sheep should yield. Belly wool should be limited to the belly region, and my illustration there kind of sets an example of where that line should typically be. We don't want belly wool to creep up either the front behind the shoulder or in front of the rear flank. That's a common area for that to happen. If belly wool is seen on the sides of an animal, it is a serious fault. And if you're registering that sheep in some of the breed registries, that would be a serious fault that would not allow for that animal's registration. I've got a pretty good visual example here, kind of a distant shot working up to close, and you can see where that bottom bar essentially hits that animal about that red line from that previous illustration. And you can see as you move in closer that this animal has belly wool basically almost touching the bottom of the next bar. And if I can use my arrow, hopefully you can kind of see this belly wool stretches up into this region here. And how I can visually see that is that wool is appears to be shorter. It appears to be kind of crushed almost. And it's the way, the manner in which that wool grows. It's crimpier almost in style. And you can almost see a little bit here in the rear flank of that animal, but certainly there's an area right here that is considered to have belly wool. This sheep was obviously not selected in this case. And so it was a nice, tight, dense fleece, but unacceptable in terms of belly wool. So, you know, this sheep would move on to market. Hopefully you can see that illustration fairly easily. Again, it takes a trained eye and a lot of experience to see that sometimes, and you have to spend some time parting that wool to look at the character or the style of that wool to really identify it as belly wool. It's not an easy thing to be able to get used to doing. I do want to talk about another unacceptable characteristic of wool that you might see, and that's in terms of camp or hair that you might see creep into regions, particularly in the breech of an animal, or off the top of the head, down behind the ears. Again, camp is a fiber that lacks strength, elasticity, and crimp. It also doesn't readily absorb dyes. It acts like hair, and therefore wools that have camp really are limited in terms of their end use. The wool and the camp take dye differently. And so this is an undesirable trait, particularly in some of our coarser wooled sheep that can creep up from the legs, particularly on the back end of a sheep. And sometimes I've even seen animals that almost have like a lion's mane of wool that has a lot of camp in it. And that again would be a very undesirable trait. Again, I mentioned this already, that it can become kind of creep up from the legs into the breech. And you know, it's fairly easy to identify though. And this animal, if it's found, it should not be continued in your flock. I'm going to talk a little bit about some other areas that we might focus in on. The head, making sure that there isn't that camp or hair or medullated fiber beyond the top knot of that sheep. And because in the shearing process, everyone should know that that top knot is removed and not kept with the fleece. I encourage you not to keep it with your belly. Some shearing crews will want to mix bellies and top knots and floor sweepings together. Your bellies, as a reminder, are more valuable than any of those other off sorts. And so you want to keep any kind of off sorts like the top knot that could have hair in it separate from your bellies. The wool cap shape can be a big deal. And what I mean by that is, does that wool extend down the face? Is that wool cap fairly limited? Meaning, is that sheep kind of bald headed? That can be a selection criteria for some breeds. You know, a Rambouillet should look like a Rambouillet and shouldn't look like a breed that doesn't have a lot of wool on its head. It should have a proper wool cap. I think eyes are important to look at. And I do have a pretty good photo here of an individual that should, you know, it has a few black spots here. But if you notice, the eyelashes and the kind of the guard hairs around the eyes are colored. That's a fairly good indicator that that sheep may have a higher amount of colored fiber throughout its wool. And so animals that would have those either brown or black colored eyelashes, if they are a white wool sheep, breed of sheep, those shouldn't be retained as well. I have a pretty extreme example. I think this is a baby doll that is completely wool blind. Some breeds, you know, there was an idea that the more wool that was on their face, the more wool that they produced. We also, at least in my area, have to worry about snow blindness. And so, you know, we want to make sure that our sheep don't have that extreme amount of wool that goes down the face. And I have a pretty good illustration here as well. These are criteria that are used in some ram tests to evaluate rams. And basically, the more closed that eye channel is, the more wool blind that sheep is, and the more problematic that is. The sheep on the left would be kind of, I would consider that not necessarily a bald-headed sheep, but he certainly doesn't have a large wool cap and very clear eye channels, and would be on the other end of the extreme. Some other issues that we should be paying attention to, of course, are to do with conformation, and these are common sense, but making sure that our sheep don't have any flaws in their draw structure, meaning that they're overshot or undershot. We sometimes forget to look for that. Sometimes it's obvious and they're easy to pick out. Sometimes they're not. And so we should be paying attention to that. If a sheep is supposed to be horned, that's fine. But if it's supposed to be polled and it has skurs, then, you know, that's not okay too. Also, here's an example of a horned Rambouillet that has a black stripe down the center of the horn. Again, that could be an indicator of more black fiber present in that white wool sheep. And so black streaks in horns would also not be acceptable. I kind of already mentioned this. If a horse, or excuse me, a sheep is supposed to be polled and it has skurs, that's an unacceptable trait. And sometimes those are very not attached and easy to remove, but we shouldn't be selecting sheep. If that breed is polled, we shouldn't be allowing animals with skurs to perpetuate if they're supposed to be polled. Just some basic conformation. You know, we need to pay attention to these things because they can be a problem. You know, particularly pastern conformation. It's very difficult for an animal with a weak pastern to have longevity in the flock. And if we're talking about rams, for instance, if he's weak on his pasterns, that might indicate some problems further down the line with breeding ewes. And so we want to make sure that a sheep has a leg on every corner. Some of our breeds have a tendency to get very narrow and almost appear like the front legs come out of the same hole. And we want to be making sure that we're paying attention to that. Also, making sure that there are no black spots running down the legs of that sheep. If it's a white wool sheep, there shouldn't be any black spots running down those legs. I know that some breeds, and for instance, the Targhee breed allows for on the ears or face some very small black, you know, one black spot or one or two black spots, but freckles is unacceptable. You know, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to that. And hoof conformation. Obviously, that has a tremendous impact on the longevity of the sheep. If they've got something wrong with their hooves, they're not going to be retained certainly on a range flock for very, very long. Kind of the last thing I want to talk maybe about is teats. And we don't want teats that have an excessive amount of wool on them. And that seems, again, kind of intuitive, because if it's got a lot of wool on it, and for instance, the shearers didn't do a very good job of cleaning up that bag, lambs can latch onto that wool instead of latching onto the teat. Making sure that the bag is symmetrical and that it has two primary teats. Here's an example of a bag that has what appears to be 4 teats. and 2 of those are functional and 2 of those are not. And so what if the lamb latches on to the one that is not functional, and basically, starves to death? And so we want to make sure that we're selecting ewes that have 2 primary teats only. Wrinkles, we want to be paying attention to wrinkles. That, of course, our shearers appreciate not having to deal with that. But some breeds are going to be more wrinkled than others. Again, here is an extreme example of some merino sheep that have a tremendous amount of neck folds and wrinkles. There's less of that, I would say, in our American merino groups here, certainly. All right, so I'm gonna change gears, kind of quickly here, and talk a little bit about why we're interested in ultrasound scanning for the sheep industry in the US. I mean, it seems very obvious that the majority of our sheep producers retain the vast majority of their income from lamb. And so the heavier, more well-muscled the lamb is, the better off that we are. Wool tends to gain a much smaller amount of the gross income for most operations. Some carcass facts: typically we consider a lamb about 50% dressing yield, and then 50% of that in terms of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts. And in most cases, industry-wide, and although this is changing with instrument grading, that ribeye, or I'll use ribeye and loin eye kind of as an interchangeable term, is not measured and is typically not, the producer is not paid for the value of that. So how are we as an industry making improvements to lamb carcass value? And I think one of the simplest ways to do that is the use of ultrasounding. And so we've been, across the US and across the globe, we've been using ultrasounds technology since the 50s. It uses high frequency sound waves, and the crystals within the transducer produce pulses that are transmitted down through the tissues and projects this image where bone and fat appears to be white and muscle appears to be that flecked darker gray. And in that image, you can pretty easily identify the loin muscle. And some really good research. And again, I'll kind of get on my soapbox a little bit, because it's an opportunity for us to advocate for some of the research that's done at the US Experiment Station in Du Bois. And this paper that I'm referring to was some good research that came from that particular project and that research center. And so again, if you ever get a chance to advocate for the sheep station, please do so, because some of this valuable research has come out of that group there, and it's so important to our industry. So as we improve loin eye area, we can drastically, or we can improve the dressing percentage of our lambs, we can improve the gross carcass value of our lambs, and we can also improve the box carcass value of our lambs. So it's an incentive to increase loin eye area. And again, ultrasound is a way to reliably estimate these carcass measurements. And the US sheep industry, and in particularly the National Sheep Improvement Program, or NSIP, has made a concerted effort to try and make more certified scanners available to US sheep producers that are interested in trying to improve the carcass value of the seed stock they're producing. And therefore the seed stock improves, those individuals or those rams or ewes are bought by commercial producers. And again, that kind of trickle down effect of improving the US sheep industry happens. It's a good reminder to think about what the heritability of some of these traits are, and why we can make kind of drastic improvements in some of these carcass characteristics through the use of ultrasound. And things like ribeye area is moderately heritable. So that means that we can make some changes rather quickly in our seed stock producers. This is just kind of a good illustration of what we're looking at. And I'm going to make a little bit of a testimonial for why the industry globally and the US has followed suit, why we measure muscle depth instead of muscle area. And you can see in this illustration, you've got the longissimus dorsi, and then you've got a little tiny circular muscle towards the right of the longissimus dorsi. And some technicians can lump that all together and overestimate the ribeye area by accident, by including that extra little circular muscle. It easily happens if you don't know your landmarks very well. And so depth is the simpler measurement for technicians to get a grasp of, and it's highly correlated to loin eye area. And so in this example, there are the landmarks there that I could see to trace the area, but again, depth is what the industry standard is for data collection for NSIP. It's basically measuring the deepest part of longissimus dorsi muscle, and then that is measured directly over the top of that. And again, those are the traits that we submit for NSIP and that a certified technician would be measuring. So kind of just to quickly, I know like I said, I sped through a lot of this information, but I think in terms of just things that you need to be thinking of if you're a seed stock producer is loin eye area is the #1 predictor of carcass value. And we can use that ultrasound technology to assess some of these carcass measurements. We're going to see improvements in dressing percentage, and we can make improvements rather quickly. We can improve the consumer acceptance of American lamb, and we've made huge strides in the last 18 months with getting more lamb available to our consumers. We want to continue to differentiate our product and make sure that consumers are asking for American lamb. And I think the last statement I want to make about this is that if you're raising terminal sire sheep or involved in direct marketing, this is a trait that you should be directly tracking. In our wool breeds of sheep, many seed stock producers are tracking this, but aren't necessarily directly selecting or putting selection pressure on ribeye. They've got a lot of other traits that they're certainly focused on, but they maybe aren't directly selecting for. They might be selecting against the poor ones. But in terms of our terminal flyer flocks, we should be putting some selection pressure on our carcass values or our carcass merit or measures. It's an easy, relatively inexpensive technology to use. And again, we're training a lot more technicians across the US. I do a pretty wide swath across the Western US, but I put on a tremendous amount of miles doing scanning across about a 6-state area. And so I think there's more interest in certainly in tracking this trait in a lot of breeds. So I'll just kind of send out a little reminder. I tried to stick as best I could to our timing. I might have ran a little bit long, but I know that there's probably some questions. And Melinda, if you want to share those with me, I can see if I can address them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us. I know it was a lot to ask of you in such a short time. Let's kick it off with, on a year like this, where a lot of our states are in a severe drought and we're cutting back as heavily as we probably ever would be. Do you see any incentives in cutting so deeply on the wool characteristics and trying to target that consistent wool within our flock?
Well, I know certainly from a wool buyer's perspective, and I do dabble in that as well, is that, you know, uniformity of that wool, uniformity as I'm looking at it, you know, is certainly a trait that increases the value for that clip. If I've got a very uniform in terms of grade, staple length, and what I think is yield, those are going to have some value determinants or value incentives for that producer. This year is a particularly difficult year, and I've seen it a lot in this area. People making deep culling, within their flock, and this year I think is an opportunity to practice some of these, evaluations and maybe be a little bit harsher and let those move on to somebody else's flock.
Sure, thank you. One question you did have related to some of the characteristics in the fleece is, can you speak a little bit on the content of lanolin, whether that's an issue or not, as far as needing to put some emphasis there?
Well, that's a kind of a difficult trait to track. I mean, ultimately you're looking at yield, and if you look over history, and I don't know the literature as well as some of my former colleagues and mentors do, but we've made tremendous strides in yield improvements since we started basically core testing wool. And I think RAM tests certainly get at that information as well, because they do individual yield samplings on rams. Not the average producer doesn't have access to be able to do that, and the OFTA technology doesn't allow for us to get an estimate of yield. And so we have seen drastic improvements. There are ways of measuring it, and there are extremes in a flock, but for the most part, you shouldn't see huge variation within that trait. I do know that WIT was looking at some of that information. I know Texas A&M was trying to get at a simpler test to be able to assess for yield, because ultimately that's what we're talking about, is lanolin will impact yield. The amount of grease will impact yield. There are some movements in trying to be able to do some quick tests for that, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
Okay. Lisa, are you going to be on for a little bit?
I can be.
Okay. If you guys have any more questions for her, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and maybe you can keep an eye on that for a few minutes. And if anybody else has more questions. And thank you so much for joining us today.
You bet. And I put my email and my phone number, and you're more than welcome to email me or text me. And I'll try and get back to you. I am going to head up to the North Country and see if they'll let me back into Canada for a week or so. That's where I'm originally from. So it's going to be nice to get away for a few days.
Great. Safe travels.
Appreciate it. Appreciate everybody their attention.